Hi, welcome to the Binmin podcast. We know that the Christian life can be hard to figure out, but we also believe that everyone should know their next step for making their spiritual life more important to them. I'm Pops.
I'm Dave.
And I'm Bob.
We've entitled this series, Why Go to Church? And today we want to talk a little bit about what are the leaders of the church. So we're going to talk about elders, pastors, and deacons. So Dave, before we get...
Pastors and deacons.
What are these things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about how these three persons, these three titles actually evolved?
Well, this is the exciting stuff because I feel like we don't often get an opportunity to talk kind of about church history, orthodoxy, origins of stuff as far as like church polity and
Where did this
structures and
stuff
stuff
come
goes.
from?
I think this stuff is really cool, and you know way more than I do. So when Jesus established the church in the 1st century AD, he appointed the 12 apostles to teach his word, capital W. And he gave them authority to both speak and write the word of God. So think Acts 2:42. During their lifetimes, these 12 apostles went out and established many churches, placed qualified people into them in leadership roles, typically as, like we just said, elders, think Acts 14, and deacons.
And that's actually why those New Testament books are called those things, like
Bingo.
Ephesians, Colossians, to the churches in Ephesus and Colossae.
Yeah, exactly. And then after the apostles died, their writings were what Bob just said. They became the New Testament, right? But they also became the final authority on matters of faith and practice. So when you're thinking of this conversation, we'll make sure to bring up even like the qualifications for these roles of elders and deacons. This is a really fun one.
Great. So we have the apostles, then we have the Word of God, which is, in this instance, the New Testament. But we have all these churches spread throughout. And so we need to have leaders that are going to run the churches.
Yeah.
So Bob, why don't you talk us through what exactly is an elder?
What do they do? What's the duties?
What are the duties of an elder? How do you do your duty? Okay. So first of all, let me just say the titles here: elder, pastor, overseer, shepherd. All of those are interchangeable.
Okay.
In most contexts.
Yeah, in most contexts.
Have significantly less manure than the others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, duty. Thank you for that. Bringing us down.
I was more so going for the shepherd thing, but
the shepherd
we're there.
thing.
We're there.
Okay, there you go.
So all of these words typically
Are interchangeable. Like they mean the same role.
Okay.
Though in English, they come out different. Like when you look at original languages.
Yeah. So like if you're looking at, let me just simply summarize it as like, it's the highest office of the church. So it's the person or the people who oversee the church and who care for it in leadership. Exactly. So when you think elder, you can think pastor.
Okay.
Because pastor is probably the one that we commonly most use. Right. So elders are simply shepherds. Right? That means that's kind of the main metaphor used about these leaders in the New Testament. So let me point to Peter, right? So the Apostle Peter, this is how he talks to elders in 1 Peter chapter 5. He says, so I exhort, or I tell you elders, the elders among you, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. And then he points out that Jesus is still the ultimate chief shepherd over all the churches. So even if you go to a church, you don't technically go to Pastor Smith's church. You go to Jesus' church. Yeah. But Pastor Smith is an under shepherd under the chief shepherd of Jesus.
Gotcha.
So all of the shepherds, in some sense, maybe this is a cheeky way to say it, like report to Jesus.
I kind of like that title though. Under shepherd. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Well, and what's crazy is like, even though there's not like, an end of year review evaluation where they're sitting down with Jesus and he's like, well, here's how you did this year as a pastor. This is actually both more wonderful and more, has more gravity to it. Like, elders, pastors, are going to be judged by Jesus at the end for being accountable for the care of the souls that they were given. So what exactly do these shepherds do to actually answer the question, like what are the duties of a shepherd? They got to do what a shepherd does. What does a shepherd do? They got to lead the sheep, right? Like a shepherd would lead a flock. They got to feed the sheep. So in a church, that means feed them good teaching. And they got to protect the sheep, right? Like a shepherd's going to protect his sheep. They need to protect the church, both from fights inside the church and from attackers outside the church.
That's great. So can anybody become an elder? Or do you have to have special qualifications to become an elder?
Well, that's an interesting way to ask that question. That's like an LSAT question. I mean, yes and yes, right? Like, sure, but like, let's describe what the qualifications are, and then you can reverse engineer how that is overlaid onto a person in order to interpret whether they can should and would be an elder. Paul does, I think, probably the best job of listing the qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. So most importantly, elders must live godly lives, 1 Peter 5, that are marked by an intimate relationship with God in Bible reading, in prayer, and in worship. But most of the qualifications fundamentally stress godly characteristics that are evident only after years and years of faithful Christian living. So
Oh yeah, like what?
I would boil them down. Here's maybe the 4 chief ones. If you're thinking, what's my rubric for eldership? Number 1, they must be self-controlled. Number 2, they need to be able to teach the gospel to others and even receive and counter feedback or attacks against that. 3, not love money. And 4, have integrity and good leadership over their family.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great.
And you can take those and parse them and see, how they extrapolate to ministry and eldership. But
Isn't that a beautiful picture too? Like, yeah, that's the kind of guy I want to follow, right?
Yeah,
That's the guy I want to be shepherded by.
Now, that sort of discusses how an elder lives within the church body. But do church members, does the membership, does the congregation have any responsibilities towards their elders?
Yeah,
Yes.
of course. Well, because the elders are for the church and the church are for the elders. So for the elders, then, the church needs to honor them because they are in an office, like Bob said, that, has these elements of authority, but also incredible responsibility.
An office not meaning cubicle, but office meaning like a role.
Oh, then I'm super confused. No, yeah, exactly.
They might have an office.
Yeah,
They also have an office.
So that, I think, is really important because like we just read those standards, that's not easy. You can't just like overnight have a 20-year mature Christian faith embodied, stripped out of the love of money and total control over your home. Like that, that has to be inside out, right? Anyway, so the elders should be honored and obeyed because they are an authority figure. Number 2, the church needs to pray for and uplift spiritually elders. And then lastly, they also need to be called upon for prayer. I think James 5.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of
Like
dynamic
if I have
here.
a need,
Go to use them because that, in their capacity as elder, as under shepherd, is very much so that.
You're a pastor, so you want to help us.
I think he prefers under shepherd
distinguish.
now. I think we've been pretty clear
yeah,
about
that's
this.
pretty good. Yeah.
As an under shepherd, can you sort of carve out the distinction between when we call someone a pastor and when we call someone an elder, even though you've also said that those two terms are synonymous?
Right. Yeah. It's like, wait, hold on. Are they the same thing or different? Because
Same, but different.
we have different, like, even at our church, we have some people that are called pastor and some that are called elder. So wait, Bob, what's the difference? Like, yeah, they're the same office, they're the same role in the New Testament, but a lot of churches, what they do is they would say, okay, the paid elders we call pastors.
Okay.
The ones that are like, they have a physical office in the church.
And full-time doing the thing.
Right, they're in full-time doing it. It's their vocation. They're getting paid for it by us, by the church. And then the unpaid elders, we just call them elders, right? They're working separate jobs, but they're also helping govern, decide, lead, pray, care over the church. So the pastors are elders who are at the church during the week. They preach on Sunday, they lead the ministries, while the unpaid elders usually have other jobs. But they're helping critically with administration, with leadership, with care, with decision making.
Well, and that's why it's not uncommon. Like in your case, weren't you ordained to the office of elder and pastor in the same ceremony?
Well, actually, can I say something different to actually a qualification? So yeah, it can be both. So like the ordination.
But oftentimes they'll be overlaid because of that distinction.
Yeah, set apart. But I actually, let me catch myself real quick because I don't want to think this is the only model. Like there are plenty of situations for guys and people who are founding churches, or we use the word planting a church, maybe at the beginning, or places in other parts of the world, or places where there's maybe just not a lot of finances to be had, where they can be bivocational, where you can still call them pastor and elder, and maybe they are working a job or a part-time job as well as pastoring.
Sure.
So I just want to make sure that that's clear, that like that person can still be called
That's
pastor.
not a biblical criteria.
So this, let's try to distinguish this. Why don't one of you guys help me understand what then are the qualifications of a pastor? We've said a lot. Somebody just help me sort of distill this down to what are then the qualifications to be a pastor?
The qualifications are the same as being an elder.
Yep.
Okay.
The distinction being that pastors typically need to use their giftedness and desire to teach more often than an elder would.
Okay.
And maybe not only that, and not in all circumstances like Bob was alluding, but typically in most contemporary churches, pastors, particularly because of this teaching capacity and full-time nature, are required to have either like a bachelor's in biblical studies, a master's, like Bob said, a degree in divinity, theology, religion, etc.
Okay. Bob, you have the most intimate knowledge when it comes to being a pastor. What, for listeners, would be the role of a pastor in today's contemporary church?
Yeah, that's a big question. So maybe I'm just going to focus on one kind of pastor, and that would be the lead pastor, or you could call him the senior pastor. That refers to the person who primarily leads the church. So what's that lead pastor, what's their role look like? Well, he does most of the preaching and teaching. He functions in an executive administrative role, meaning kind of overseeing the many complex organizational structures and kind of supervision of many staff members. Again, that'll depend on the size of the church, of course. And he's going to officiate baptisms and weddings and funerals. And as an elder, he's responsible for discipling, for counseling, for disciplining, right? When people aren't actually living out their Christian life, they need to be removed from the church. That's another discussion coming out of Matthew chapter 18, and also just modeling godliness. So depending on the size of the church, there can also be additional pastors. So kind of like my role, I'm not a lead pastor, but there can be additional pastors who oversee different areas and help lead ministries, but they're not necessarily preaching every Sunday, and they don't necessarily have the top leadership role.
Bingo. Yep.
So Dave, let's move then from talking about elders and pastors. Let's talk about the other responsibility in the church, and that's deacons. You want to describe that for us?
As an ordained subdeacon of the Anglo-Catholic Church, I would love to, yeah.
Yeah, what are deacons?
Well, that's your Dwight Schrute, right? So if Bob's the Michael Scott, I'm the assistant too. No, so deacons, they are in many ways, an assistive capacity, for sure. But deacon by definition means to serve. So think of them as that role where in the first church, there were 7 deacons created to go out and assist in the early planted churches, doing the roles like distributing charitable gifts evenly and fairly, while the apostles were able to concentrate full-time on their preaching and prayer. So I think, like, for deaconism, go to Acts 6 and kind of read historically what that looked like. But that's why oftentimes in a church you'll see those roles and you're like, oh, so maybe not going to preach up at the pulpit all the time, but they're greasing the skids, maybe with operations and helping in a whole lot of capacities, service-wise.
What are the qualifications for a deacon? Are they the same for the elder? Can anyone be a deacon?
Yeah, so the Apostle Paul also outlines the qualification of deacons in the same place Dave pointed to a second ago in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And they share a lot of the same godly characteristics as elders. So deacons need to be not greedy, they need to be sober-minded, they need to be faithful to their wife and family. Excuse me, but there's also probably a couple of tweaks you might add.
Yeah. And I'm not saying this just wholesale, like you should look for these traits in particular, but I am saying, so unlike elders, deacons can be younger in the faith. You know, they not that it's any less serious or anything like that, but can be younger in the faith. Verse 6, don't necessarily need to have the gifting or ability to teach and or refute false doctrines. And even when you think of maybe like Stephen or Philip, you know, they were still gifted though for ministry.
Yeah, so they were the first deacons.
But when you think deacons, you can think, okay, they were young men.
Yeah.
They weren't the Pauls of their time, but they were in fact incredible able-bodied servants doing a whole lot of good for the kingdom. You know,
talking from your perspective then as a pastor, what are deacons doing in the contemporary church?
Yeah, well, I mean, you guys have seen this too in the churches where you're at and where you've been at. Like, the deacons kind of humbly serve the elders. So again, I do really think the deacon role means assistant to the elder, right? As much as maybe it's from the office or whatever, or not.
It reminds me of a song by the Devil Wears Prada. No, I'm just kidding. You carry on.
You know, like, yeah, they are assistant to the elders. So, and they serve the congregation by usually tending more toward practical and logistical needs in the church. So like that way they free the pastors to be able to devote themselves to preaching, teaching, praying, and leading.
Gotcha.
Right? So for instance, I've been a part of churches where deacons have helped look after the facilities, helped follow up with newcomers to the church, visited people who were sick and in the hospital, contacted church members to ask how they could pray for them. That's the ways they kind of more service-oriented serve the church and thereby assist the elders.
That's wonderful. We come to that part where we talk about the so what question.
Yeah.
How does this information on church leadership help us as members of a church?
Yeah. So what?
Yeah, well, for one, I think just understanding the various mantles of responsibility helps you understand better the enormous responsibility that leadership in a church carries. It's not just a flitting title in the right context. I mean, it's an incredible burden. I know Bob's life has been transformed in many ways because of the office he now engages and carries. But I'd say, though churches operate differently, just broad strokes wise, I think it also has an impact on how you move forward in your spiritual life. So if you're wanting discipleship or you need counseling or whatnot, reach out to a pastor or elder. If you're studying the Word and you come across a really, particularly challenging area or have theological questions, need someone to officiate a wedding, a funeral, etc., reach out to a pastor. If you need home visitation, help financially, some other operational challenge, I'd reach out to a deacon. These offices, again, are meant for the church and the church for the leaders, right? This is meant to be a synergy that is constantly giving back and forth.
Yeah, that really is an excellent summary, Dave. So our next question then is directed at you. What's your next step?
Yeah, what's your next step this week? Pray for your leaders. Figure out how to get a list, maybe, of those who lead your church. Your pastors, your elders, your deacons. It might be as simple as just pulling that up on the website of your church. And you can check out their names, their email addresses, their photos, and pick 2 that you're just simply going to pray for this week. You could even email them and thank them for leading and then ask how you could pray for them.
Yeah.
I've been so encouraged by people who reached out to me and said, hey, Bob, how can we pray for you? There are few things in life as encouraging as knowing someone is praying for you. So as you do this, let us know how that went for you. Was it hard? Was it difficult? Was it better than you thought to be able to pray for your leaders? Comment here. Let us know on our socials because we love hearing from you as you take next steps.
That's great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dave. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Binmin podcast. We know that the Christian life can be hard to figure out, but we also believe that everyone should know their next step for making their spiritual life more important to them. Binmin exists as a resource ministry to help you discover that next step.
Yeah. So please check out our other episodes and even the show notes for this episode on binmin.org. And make sure to subscribe to this channel so you're made aware when we release new content and you can engage with that and share that and reach out to us about what you thought about it. Follow us on social media too because there's a lot of different stuff happening over there intentionally as we're expanding content there. Thank you again for joining us, taking time out of your day to receive this. Hope that it blessed you and we're looking forward to next time. God bless.